So this is a lecture that I gave originally at the Southwestern Philosophical Society's meeting. It was originally supposed to be at Vanderbilt, but COVID, right? And so we moved it to be online, and I just wanted to record this because I had a few people asking if there was a recording. Uh, it was great. It was a really great conference, and I had a really fantastic commentator in Carl Aho, and then there were a bunch of other people who asked me fantastic questions in the Q&A. So this is roughly that lecture. Hopefully, I still know the material from a few days ago, but let's talk about it. All right. So this is a lecture called "Possessed: The Cynics on Wealth and Pleasure." Okay, and the first part of this is just taking a look at this particular painting. And this painting is Alexander and Diogenes. That's the title of it, by Edwin Landseer. And so I'm going to talk about this story in some detail, but basically you just have to know that this is Alexander the Great, the big bulldog, right, kind of like thing, and this little scruffy mutt is Diogenes of Sinope, the Cynic philosopher, right? And they have this confrontation that's very, very famous. And I like this painting because there's dogs and it's cute, right? But I also like it because look at the expression on this dog. I think it's smug. I think it's mischievous, which is like pretty fitting for cynics and cynic philosophy. And part of the inspiration for this paper was a particular quote by Diogenes. It's said that he said, "Wealth is the vomit of fortune." Right? Wealth is the vomit of fortune. And this particular quote inspired me to try and look into the cynics on wealth and poverty. What do they say about this? And wealth being the vomit of fortune, obviously that's not a good thing. And we can just kind of assume here that we are not talking about dog Diogenes, right? We're talking about human Diogenes, and human Diogenes wouldn't want to eat this particular type of vomit of fortune, right? So human Diogenes is who we're talking about here, all right? But I want to talk about this, okay? I want to talk about this because there's a huge contrast between these two characters. Basically, the story goes is a confrontation between Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world at the time, huge standing army. He's educated. In fact, he was tutored by Aristotle, and he was rich, and he had perfumes and fine clothing, and he had an entourage, and he's sort of reflected in all of these dogs over here, right? And then over on the side, we have Diogenes of Sinope, who's exiled. He's originally from Sinope, which is in Asia Minor, and he had to leave Sinope for Greece after he and his father got in trouble for adulterating the currency. So probably manipulating currency, maybe also just like antagonizing certain social values, right? And Diogenes of Sinope was poor, and he was probably smelly. He was infamous for eating beans and onions and all sorts of stuff like that. And he lived a solitary life for the most part. So just a huge contrast between these two characters. Again, I think it's very well reflected in the painting. And so here's the story. Here's the story. Alexander the Great had just accomplished some big political feat. All right. And so a lot of people around him, they're celebrating. He has an entourage, right? He's the emperor. People are really loving it. But there's one person who doesn't seem to care. And that's Diogenes of Sinope. And he just seems to be sunbathing, right? Sunbathing. And Alexander's kind of impressed by this. And so he goes over to Diogenes. And maybe he says something like this. We have a lot of different fragments, and I'm piecing them together in a particular time frame. But Alexander said, supposedly, "I am Alexander, the great king," right? And Diogenes said, "I am Diogenes, the dog." And I love that. I love that. I love that Diogenes pits the dog, his title, an insult that people threw at him, as equivalent to being a great king or the emperor. Alexander is so smitten, I think, with Diogenes. He really loves his independence. He loves his brashness. He'd heard of his wisdom. And he says, look, ask whatever you desire, right? Whatever you want. I, Alexander, with all of my power and all of my money, will give it to you. Diogenes, what can I give you, man? What can I give you, right? And Diogenes has one request, and he says, stand out of my light, right? And so, like, that's a That's a hell of a request. It's a hell of a request. And, a lot of people laugh. So his entourage, I like this person with the blue bow, I guess. A lot of people laugh. Everyone is entertained, right? This scruffy man who Alexander went out his way to talk to reduces him to basically a block on his light, And so everyone laughs at the brashness of it. But Alexander supposedly says, had I not been Alexander, I would like to have been Diogenes. And I think that's an interesting reply, right? That's pretty positive. Alexander the Great says, look, if I couldn't be this emperor, I would want to be Diogenes. So this is a dramatic encounter. It has like some really famous stories or famous characters in ancient history, and it was preserved by a lot of different people. So it's a really, really evocative story. But I think that there's something really important here, and these are kind of takeaways that I would say from the story. There's basically two reactions to cynicism. Okay. One is an entertained but a dismissive audience. I think that's what we see in the entourage, the people who are watching this interaction between Alexander and Diogenes, right? They like it, but they don't really think too much of it. They just kind of laugh and move on. The second reaction is something like spurned but reflective, and that's in Alexander. Alexander just been slighted, and he'd been slighted by someone that basically is doesn't have a home, doesn't have many possessions, all that kind of stuff, but he thinks, right? He thinks. And I think that this is kind of like how people might react to cynicism, and not just cynicism in particular, but its constituent asceticism. So it's attack on pleasure. It's simple life. It's anti-materialist life. So entertained but dismissive, or spurned but reflective. All right. But here's a troubling thought. Troubling thought is Cynic asceticism and contrarianism. So their attack on pleasure in the asceticism, and their contrarianism. They're always like coming up with opinions and trying to show people for not knowing what they think they know, or showing how ridiculous their beliefs are. They call bullshit on a lot of stuff, basically. So the asceticism and the contrarianism, the good is, by cynics kind of living outside of society and constantly criticizing the central values, they aren't complicit in any of the bad things that society does, right? They're outside of it, and they're constantly trying to like call it out, right? The bad is that it might lead to barriers for political uptake and reform. And so what I mean by that is these people who are outside the system, because they're outside of the system, they don't share any of the shame or the guilt. But because they're outside of the system, they're not inside the system to either gain favor or audience or really be able to revise it, right? And so this is a potential problem. And I want to give a particular shout out to Scott Aiken here at Vanderbilt University. This past summer, we worked together on writing a paper that we're trying to find a home for right now. And this is like something that he and I talked a lot about. I hope this presentation isn't just a ripoff of Aiken, but we were reading the Cynics together, and sort of this is one of the things that came out of that. All right. The first lesson that I want to stress, and this is by far going to be the longest part of the presentation, is that, for the Cynics, happiness is autarkeia, or self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency is the central value. Okay? What does that mean? Well, look, the goal of life, the goal of self-sufficiency for the Cynics is to learn to rule and help yourself. Autarkeia is coming from two Greek words that basically means to be able to rule over yourself, right? And the Cynics wanted this independence. They wanted this sense of freedom. Freedom is a motif in a lot of their sayings. And there's a lot of really great ones, but I'm going to use some sayings throughout this presentation. And one is that the Cynics countered luck with courage, convention with nature, and emotion with reason. Diogenes, according to Dio Chrysostom, who himself lived as a Cynic for part of his life, said that Diogenes of Sinope had a sufficient supply of food and moderate clothing, but from public affairs, lawsuits, rivalries, wars, and factions, he kept himself clear. So what we get here, this self-sufficient value, is basically meant to make you independent. Make you independent, right? But what does that look like? What does that look like? Well, they lived what some people called the hemorrhoids, which is basically just literally the daily life. a daily life subsisting from day to day. Their feet were bare, right? Diogenes didn't wear shoes. Their backs had single cloaks. Maybe they were doubled over a little bit, but like it wasn't fancy. In the summer, you could tie it up whenever you're hot. In the winter, whenever you're cold, you can fold it around yourself, right? But that was their main garment, loincloth and a cloak. That's basically it. Their bellies. So their diets were mostly vegetarian. They ate lots of beans and water. There's lots of stories of cynics eating beans of various types, maybe some lettuce every now and again, but basic food and cold water. That's what they did. And their houses were in the open air. So Diogenes of Sinope famously lives in sort of a discarded wine cask, sometimes depicted as a wine barrel. And he would joke that he could wheel his house anywhere. It was just kind of mobile. He could go wherever he wanted. If it were too hot, in southern Greece, he could move north, right? And if it's too cold in the north, he could move south. He just joked that gave him independence, right? In the winter, he could turn the mouth of his little wine cask toward the sun. And the summer, he could turn the mouth of the wine cask away from the sun, right? He did this. This is like a very bare, again, anti-materialist life. And the question is, why? Why would you live this way? And I think that it's because for the Cynics, and this is a really central lesson, human animality is always greater than cultivated civility, right? Human animality, being just a natural human being, that is way better than anything that civilization can offer us. In other words, part of living the appropriate life is letting your body do what it does naturally. Okay, we have like an amazing body that can adapt to a lot of different circumstances, but we often don't do it because we're so distracted, I guess, by the luxuries of civilization, right? We can acclimate to cold. We can acclimate to heat. We can endure a lot of different things. We can live on a relatively basic diet, but we don't do that. And the Cynics think that that's a huge mistake. So they want us to live more naturally in this animalistic sense, right? So the focus of Cynic intellectual thought is on ethics, okay? The only worthwhile domain of study for them is ethics. It's about, our lives, how we can become better or worse. That's what it's about. It's about, political community. It's about those values that help us there. So it shouldn't be a surprise that unlike other schools in philosophy, they don't really have a detailed physics. They don't have like a lot of geometry or logic or anything like that. They don't like a lot of the theoretical stuff. The theoretical stuff is largely a distraction. But they didn't just stop there. They also didn't have literature, they didn't have music, and they didn't really like any of that as well. Literally, everything is a distraction except for studying ethics. And ethics is only good insofar as it actually helps you to live well. You're not getting caught up in all of these abstract metaethical or theoretical stuff. The goal is to live well, and by living well, I mean living self-sufficiently, right? That's the key. That's the key. But despite that, I think that there are patterns in kind of what they talked about. I don't know that it's intentional necessarily, but they do have a very specific argument style. And this argument style is something like arguing in implicit dilemmas, okay? So they put things basically into two options a lot of times. And I think that the implicit dilemma that they're giving, because they write mostly in aphorisms, short passages, maybe historians are talking about really punchy, pithy sayings and jokes, right? That's kind of what they do. That's their style. And so the dilemma usually is develop self-sufficiency, develop autarkeia, or else, right? And they didn't spend a lot of time. There's occasional moments where they extol the beauties of self-sufficiency and freedom, right? A lot of times what instead they do is they focus on the downsides. They focus on the or else. Basically, if you don't develop self-sufficiency, here are the vices that you're going to develop, and here are the bad things that life is going to do to you, right? So pick your option, right? Develop self-sufficiency, that looks pretty good, even if it means a lot of anti-materialist kind of lessons, or the or else. You're not free, you're full of anxiety, all of the ills that they sort of point at in contemporary civilization. For them, ancient Greece and Rome, but I think that the point holds for today, right? And I think that the most dramatic dilemma and illustration of what I'm talking about here is Diogenes Laertius sort of recounts this saying where the Cynic said, to get through life, you need either logos or brokos. Okay? A lot of you out there probably know logos. Logos is a Greek word for reason or an account or word, but in this case, reason, right? So to get through life, you need reason. You need to be rational. You need to be able to overcome your emotions and overcome the crappy values. You need to be able to be intentional about your life. Or you need brokos. And brokos is something that could be interpreted as a rope, which could mean a halter. So basically, if you can't control yourself, you need to be controlled with a halter. But I also want you to know that this word also means noose, right? In certain contexts. And so what they could be saying is something along the lines of be rational or end it, right? It's done. It's done. And that's like a really jarring and kind of a messed up saying, right? But that's what the Cynics were about. They were about saying these things that just kind of like dug into your conscience, that tried to illustrate their points, right? My roommate, of course, is in the background. Maybe you can see her there. Okay. So how do you do this? How do you start to take these Cynic lessons and become better, become more self-sufficient? The key here is ascesis. Ascesis is a Greek word that basically means training or exercise, all right? And it's where we get our word asceticism. So whenever we call a monk, for example, ascetic or something like that, like in the ancient Christian tradition, this is the word that it's coming from. A really intense, disciplined exercise or training or activity. And this is a central idea to cynicism. And Diogenes Laertius, again, preserves this particular insight, which he said, Diogenes said that no success can be achieved in life without training, which he said could overcome anything. All right? So on the one hand, if you want to be successful, you need to be very disciplined. Do your exercises, do your training. And if you do that, there are a lot of upsides, and the upsides are that you can overcome pretty much anything, right? So what this basically, to my philosophical mind, says is that training, ascesis, is a necessary condition for a good life, okay? And I'm going to give you another bit of philosophical jargon here. It's necessarily coextensive with self-sufficient and good people. So what do I mean by these two things? I mean that if you were to find a lot of self-sufficient people, these people who strove for autarkeia, right? If you were to find these good people, the people who were leading the best, the most flourishing, full human lives, he's going to say that all of those people are going to be disciplined, right? They will have undergone some sort of intense training, philosophical training, not necessarily in the academic sense, but in the sense that they've subjected their values and their beliefs to severe scrutiny. They've trained every element of themselves to become a good person, right? And this can take place in a lot of different ways. I mean, the Cynics felt that ascesis should train the entire person, okay? And that means the body. That means the body. So there was a lot of physical exercises that Cynics did. So for example, in order for Diogenes to live this life where he was comfortable with living relatively basically, he would acclimate himself to the seasons. So in the summer, to get used to the heat, he would roll around in hot sand. In the winter, to get used to the cold, he would hug statues while being bare, right? He would do a lot of things to keep his body disciplined. It's really, really important. And in addition, there's a lot of mental training as well. And so I think a quote that talks about this is from Stoic. And it says, Diogenes laughed at those who lock away their treasures with bolts and locks and seals, but throw open their own body with all its windows and doors, namely their mouth and genitals and ears and eyes. Right? So whenever you look at people are often like really confused. They lock away their treasures, their money or whatever it is, prized possessions. But then, arguably the most valuable thing that we have, our body, right? They're like, yeah, I'll do whatever with it. I'll do whatever with it. Open my mouth, open my eyes, open my ears, let my genitals take me wherever they take me, right? And again, this constant inversion of imagery and really zeroing in on a lot of social values that are bunk for the Cynics, right? Okay. This quote in particular, though, I think is really important, and I'm going to spend some time using this to talk about the moral psychology of the Cynics. So again, they didn't really have these, deep psychological conversations in their own stuff, right? You do get intense and detailed accounts of psychology from Aristotle, for example. He literally has a book called De Anima, or On the Soul, right? It's implicit in a lot of Epicurean stuff. Epicureans have all sorts of stuff about pleasure and pain and how those function. Not so much for the Cynics, but I think we can piece together a little something from some of the things that have been preserved, right? And one particular quote here I think is gonna help us understand a lot of that. And this quote is: "The contempt for pleasure, if it has become habitual, is exceedingly pleasurable. Just as those who have been accustomed to living pleasurably find the opposite unpleasant, so do those who have been engaged in the opposite practice find that despising pleasures gives them more pleasures than would the pleasures themselves." Right? So there's something about pleasure that it seems maybe to change, or it can be trumped in a lot of ways whenever we take a different evaluation of it. Because if we start to hate pleasure, so he says, hold pleasure in contempt for pleasure, that can actually become pleasurable, right? So there's a couple of lessons that I want to pull from this particular quote. The first one is that I think that this is an accusation of basically how most of us operate, okay? The Cynics observe that we just sort of automatically seem to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Right? That makes sense. If it feels good, we go toward it. If it feels bad, we go away from it, right? This, though, is what makes luxury so destructive, and especially something that the Cynics didn't like, right? Because nothing compares to luxury, all right? If you are someone who lives in luxury and takes advantage of a lot of the things of civilization, pretty much anything that's going to make you a better person, which takes discipline and work, or asks you to get rid of some of the luxury, it's going to feel terrible, and you're not going to like it. So by moving your baseline for pleasure up, by being, in a state of luxury, it makes all of the hard work of becoming a good person, a more natural person, feel awful. And if you're operating on this autopilot sort of non-reflective kind of thing, you just don't get better. Luxury is really destructive. It's really destructive because it makes the baseline, the default setting, something that it shouldn't have been in the first place, right? And there's a really fantastic quote here where Diogenes said, "If you avoid the discomforts of the industrious," so he's talking to a lazy person, "you will incur the misfortunes of the neglectful." Right? If you let your pleasures rule you, stuff is not going to turn out well for you. Right? That's what the Cynics are trying to get at. The second lesson is a little more abstract, but I think I can explain it okay. Ascesis, this discipline, these training exercises, that kind of stuff, it seems to prioritize second order evaluation. Okay, and what I mean by that is it's not just about the sensations that we feel for, like, I have some coffee here, drinking coffee, or I just ate a piece of toast with Nutella. It's not about the first order sensations, right? It's not about, how good that is or how bad that is. It's about how we evaluate those sensations, the evaluation of what's going on. Okay? And discipline, ascesis, which I'm translating ascesis as, being something relevant to discipline. It changes how we feel about the first order stuff. He says contempt for pleasure, right? It can turn into pleasure. Through cultivation, we can change how we feel about the first order. And we can change it by understanding how it affects with our second order goal, right? That more abstract, that ascent in analysis, and in particular, with whether it makes us more free, whether it makes us more self-sufficient, right? And I think this is exactly what they're trying to get at here. And I want to give you two test cases that get talked about in some of the anecdotes. By the way, there's a paper version of this that's going to be published in the Southwestern Philosophical Review. Okay, so if this is like too much to take in, or if you're like reading more, I think that'll be published probably sometime in the spring of 2022. Right, so in a few months from when I'm recording this. But there's two test cases, okay, and there you can see all of the sources and all of that. But I will give like a plug to this particular book here. This is Diogenes the Cynic, Sayings and Anecdotes. This was compiled by Robin Hard, has a lot of translations. It's excellent. It's really tough to find all of the fragments that the Cynics did. Like, obviously, you can read something like The Lives of Eminent Greek Philosophers, which I have the new Oxford version here. This is an excellent book. But there's a lot of other sources besides this. And the Hard anthology and translation is really fantastic. So if you want something on the Cynics, get that Diogenes Sayings and Anecdotes. That'll get you right in the game, right? But one of these anecdotes, Diogenes is eating a cake. And as he's eating a cake, a passerby is like, "Hey, man, Diogenes, that's a little sus. That's a little weird. What are you doing? I thought that, cynics were philosophers. They didn't eat cakes, right? Well, what are you doing?" Because again, he's anti-materialist, right? He says to eat water and eat or drink water and eat beans, right? What is Diogenes doing eating a cake, a confection, a luxury? Didn't you spend a lot of your time saying luxuries are bad? And Diogenes said, "Look, philosophers eat cakes, but not like the rest of you, right? Not like you normies." So I think that that's an interesting case. The second one, and this is a work from Lucian. Lucian is a really diverse writer, but he writes this satirical work where a lot of the philosophers are basically trying to sell their philosophy. And in this work, the cynic is talking about a lot of stuff, like cynics do, and then he ultimately ends up saying like, "Hey, I heard you, cynic. You can take a beating, right? You could be flogged." And the cynic basically agrees, and he's like, "How? How? Like, you don't have a shell like a turtle. You don't have armor like a crab. How is it that you can take your beatings and not really complain about them?" And the cynic replies, "Look, philosophers can take a flogging, right? They can get flogged, and they can feel it, but not with their tongues, in the sense, right? So they might feel this first order pain, but they won't complain about it. Now, they complain about a lot of stuff, but they won't complain about the pain. There's something about the philosophical training, that second order prioritization, that keeps the first order from being overwhelming, or that allows them to basically moderate what's going on with that, right? And what I think the lesson is here is that there's probably something like no intrinsic goodness or badness of pleasures or pains. Okay? They pleasures and pains are neither good nor bad in and of themselves. It just depends. It depends, right? The first order, it can be wishy-washy, right? What's more important is the second order, and the second order can then change how we experience the pleasures and the pains. The cynics, in my view, are autarkists, right? Meaning that they are people who believe in the value of self-sufficiency and of freedom. They're not hedonist. Hedonists just say that pleasure is the good, and they're not masochists, They're not someone who's going to say that pain is the good. It's not like something from Hellraiser or something like that, the Cenobites, right? Instead, they're focused on autarkeia, self-sufficiency. That's what it's all about, all right? And I think that there are some lessons that we can take from these cases, right? The one is that training seems to be able to protect you from corruption. So this is the cakes example. Luxuries can corrupt you. But with proper philosophical training, it's okay to eat a cake because you sort of realize the dangers of luxury, and your philosophical training keeps you from being lured in to all of the trappings of luxury. And the same sort of training desensitizes you to stings. It makes the pains that you kind of have to go through more bearable, right? And maybe even pleasurable in certain ways. So this has two things that get derived from this. One is that simple, natural toils become pleasant. Simple, natural toils become pleasant, right? So there's a story basically where Diogenes is washing lettuce, right? He's about to eat it. It's a basic thing. Comes out of the earth, so you gotta wash it. And Plato comes by and he's like, "Hey, Diogenes, if you had paid tribute to Dionysus, you wouldn't have to be washing lettuce. So if you weren't such a jerk, and if you didn't pay tribute to this particular tyrant, Dionysus, you could be going to the banquet where I'm headed," right? Diogenes quips back to Plato and he said, look, if you would wash lettuce, you wouldn't have to pay tribute to Dionysus. Basically saying, I know what I'm doing, man. I'd rather eat this lettuce than go to that banquet with a tyrant. What good is a tyrant? Yeah, there might be good food there, but it's going to be awful. I'm comfortable with the decision I made, right? Is it a hassle to have to wash lettuce? Is the food not as, delectable or culinarily complex? Is all of the goodness at a banquet, does it compare to the culinary goodness of lettuce? No, not really. But what Diogenes is saying here is that doesn't matter, because the toil of washing a lettuce is not a toil at all whenever you understand how it contributes to your self-sufficiency. And moreover, the complicated civilized luxuries are actually pains. They're traps. They can take away your freedom. Plato had to pay tribute to Dionysus, right, in this story. It's not, no one eats for free, no free lunch, that kind of thing, right? And I want to stress, though, that the Cynics are not people who basically thought that life was crummy. There are challenges, but it's not crummy, because someone said, to someone who declared that life is an evil, Diogenes said, not living itself, but living badly. Right? It's not that life is bad. It's that you live badly. And if you live badly, okay, then life is bad. But follow my Cynic lessons, and I'll treat you how to live well, or I'll train you to live well. That's what Dionysus is saying, or not Dionysus, sorry, Diogenes. So there's a couple of really important images from sort of Cynic philosophy that I kind of want to talk about. These are very quick points compared to the bulk of the lecture that I just gave. But Prometheus is not a hero to the Cynics. Rather, Hercules is. Okay? So with Prometheus, this is the Titan, right, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to the humans. And this is often taken as a good thing, right? Because fire can be read as a symbol for knowledge, but fire as well can be used for tool making, right? It can keep us warm in all of the seasons. It can do lots of stuff for us. So a lot of people kind of appreciate that Prometheus gave the fire to us humans so that we could live our cultivated and civilized life, right? And they thought that, it was bad whenever the Olympian gods punished Prometheus for giving the humans the fire and chained him to a rock and made it such that this vulture comes and pecks out and devours his liver every single day, and then it leaves, and then Prometheus regrows the liver, and then the vulture comes back the next day. That's Prometheus's punishment for stealing the fire and giving it to the humans, right? A lot of people think Prometheus did good. The Olympians were doing something really messed up when they gave him that punishment. Not so much with the Cynics. The Cynics thought that the fire of Prometheus made us soft. It made us indulgent. Okay? What did we use fire for? Did we use that to become better? No. So here's a quote here. This is from Dio Chrysostom. He says, humans do not employ their cleverness, Sophia, so that's the Greek word for wisdom, to promote courage or justice, but to procure pleasure. So what do we use Promethean fire for? We don't use it to become wiser, to become better people. We use it to make cakes. We use it to build, big houses that we don't need. We use it to do all of these things that don't matter. They don't matter. And moreover, they make our lives more complicated. They make us more bound to a lot of things that shouldn't matter. It takes away from our lives. So the Promethean fire made us soft and indulgent. It actually didn't help us, right? Part of this is tied to their attacks on wealth, right? Wealth is a bad thing. And the Cynics said virtue can't live in rich houses or cities. Okay? And they have a lot of times where they say this, but I want to give you one of my favorite quotes by them, which is, look, houses that have the most food in them also have many mice and weasels, right? So not only does wealth seem bad, right? It's just that whenever you look at wealthy people, they often don't have virtue, according to the Cynics. And even if wealth isn't the direct cause, you're never going to find virtue and wealth together. Okay, it's that coextension point. Are you going to find these options separate or together with things? And if you find wealthy people, Diogenes is going to say you're probably not going to find virtuous people, right? He's not going to state it as nicely as I just did, but he's definitely going to make that assertion. And we get a lot of this from a lot of different sources, but a motif as well in Cynic philosophy is that tyrants are miserable. Okay, they try and get a lot of power. They try and take advantage of that and live these really luxurious lives. But because of that, they're always afraid. They're always anxious because they're paranoid. They're worried about conspirators working against them, even within their own walls, maybe within their own family, right? And they really need rest and respite, maybe to have some wine, kick back for a little bit. But if they do that, what does that do? It makes them more vulnerable, right? So they're paranoid. And okay, so like let's decide that they want to live somewhere else. Where are they going to go? Everywhere they go, they're going to be hated. The tyrant is actually super miserable. It's not all it's cracked up to be. Don't fall for that trap, the Cynics are going to say, right? So if we can't admire Prometheus, who should we admire? Hercules. Hercules. Not the fancy, glamorous Hollywood Hercules, but the Hercules of the legends. This guy who wore a pelt and he carried a club, which isn't, I mean, like, just think about how brutal that weapon is. It's not a sophisticated weapon. It's a club, right? It's a pronounced stick, basically. That's the guy we should admire, right? And so part of this, I'm going to give you some quotes. The Cynics would say, the noblest people are those who despise riches, reputation, pleasure, and concern for life, and thus are able to overmaster their opposites, poverty, ill repute, suffering, and death. Okay? So the Cynics, they're going to say, actively get away from your love for riches, reputation, pleasure, and concern for life. Stop that. Because what's important in life is being able to endure things like poverty, ill repute, so bad reputation, suffering, and death. And you don't do that through riches, reputation, pleasure, and concern for life. You do that through the opposite, right? Simplicity, being a natural sort of animal, right? That's the strategy. That's the strategy. And not only is wealth bad, poverty is actually really important, okay? And the Cynics will say this: what philosophy attempts to persuade us by means of arguments, poverty compels us to in very deed. So philosophy can try and give you lots of arguments, but when it comes down to it, whenever you're living this impoverished life, actually, that is what's going to make you live that philosophical life, right? Poverty is actually a good thing because it keeps you from getting caught up in all of the BS in society and everything else. Hercules traveled light and he slew monsters. He didn't have much. He had his pelt, he had his club, did lots of different things, traveled the world, made the world better by slaying the monsters. So, the Cynics, they try and live simply, and they try to combat vice. So there's this interesting passage, and I'm forgetting who the exact source is, where Crates of Thebes, who is Diogenes of Sinope's student, right, another Cynic, they're comparing him to Hercules. Hercules had a club, Crates had a staff, because when he was an old man, he needed it to walk, right? Hercules had the lion pelt, Crates had a cloak, right? His simple cloak. So Hercules traveled around slaying monsters. Crates traveled around calling out the vices of society. So the Cynics really took this Hercules metaphor seriously, right? They tried to live the life of Hercules, not Prometheus, not this divine, cultivated civilization. Look at all the stuff that we can do with fire. No. It's a person on a mission, a person who's living simply, and a person who is actively combating the ills of society, right? So what happens as a result of this? I think, there's something interesting about the Cynic life, in that it starts to cultivate this perspective where they're basically going against everyone. They're going against everyone, right? And there were a lot of different a lot of different views on wealth in the ancient world, and the ancient world kept them separated, right? And so I just want to give you a little bit of proof, a little bit of background to really drive home my concluding point, which I promise I'm getting to. And this is that there are different views on wealth, right? The Cynics hate it. Hopefully I've shown that pretty clearly already. But that wasn't the case with everyone. Here's Aristotle. This is from the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle says, nevertheless, happiness clearly also requires external goods. So not just psychological goods. It requires stuff external. In addition, as we have said, for it is impossible, or not easy, to perform fine actions if one is without resources. For in the first place, many things are done by means of friends or wealth or political power, as if by tools. So what Aristotle is basically saying here is that wealth is actually a necessary condition for flourishing or happiness, right? In order for you to live the complete human life, according to Aristotle, you do need at least a little bit of access to wealth, in addition to friends, maybe some political power, stuff like that, because that serves you in cultivating a good character and in accomplishing all of those things that we think are important in you being able to live a good life. So Aristotelians and Aristotle, they don't buy this Cynic line of argument at all. They're going to say not only is wealth not bad, wealth is actually like really important for you to be able to live a good life. Okay? There's another perspective. This is represented by the Stoics. I'm going to quote Epictetus, who's a very famous Stoic, his handbook, really tiny book. You can probably find a copy of it for a couple of bucks. Quick read, really influential, cool stuff. I would totally recommend it. And one of the sayings in this book is this particular saying that I'm going to put here. And that is this. Remember, Epictetus says, that you are an actor in a play, which is as the playwright wants it to be. So we're all living a life, and this life is kind of like a play, and the play is exactly as the playwright, aka God, wants it to be. And so if God wants you to play a beggar, then play even this part skillfully. Or if he wants you to be a cripple or a public official or a private citizen, what is yours is to play the assigned part well. So Epictetus here is saying it's not up to you to decide what fortune you get in life, but what is up to you is to whatever fortune you get to play it well. Okay? If that makes you wealthy, then fine, play that well. If that makes you poor, fine, play that well. Not up to you to change your fortune. The externals don't matter. All that matters is your attitude, right? Your ability to control your thoughts, your feelings, your values, what you like and what you don't like. You can control that, but you can't control the external stuff. Okay? And the Cynics are the Stoics are interesting because they have like radically different people. Okay? So I told you about Epictetus, but they also had Marcus Aurelius. Okay? And these are interesting contrasts. Epictetus was a slave. And he was a slave who didn't have use of one of his arms or legs, depending on the tradition that you read, right? He was not what a lot of people would take as a super powerful person, even though he was like educated and stuff like that. So a slave, Stoic, Marcus Aurelius, Meditations here, right? This is a fantastic book. This is the translation by Gregory Hayes, and this is by the Modern Library. Totally recommend this translation with the red bird and the white feather. It's really incredible. But the Stoics are going to say the externals don't matter. The externals don't matter. So wealth is not a necessary condition. So they go against the Aristotelians. Wealth isn't important for life. But if you have it, it's okay. Otherwise, Marcus Aurelius couldn't have been a very good Stoic, right? An emperor has a lot of wealth. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome. Okay? So what views do we have here? Aristotle, wealth is a necessary condition. You need it for happiness. The Stoics said, well, look, it's not necessary, but it's okay. It's okay. The Cynics are going to say, I disagree with Aristotle. It is not a necessary condition for happiness. So you kind of have a little bit of agreement with the Stoics. But I disagree with the Stoics as well, because the Stoics are going to say it's okay to have wealth. The Cynics are going to say, no, wealth is a danger. Luxury is a danger. Not only is it not a necessary condition, you can't be indifferent to it, Stoics. You have to actively oppose it. Now, part of this might be a historical fact in that Stoicism came out of Cynics. So a lot of these philosophies are existing at the same time. Zeno of Citium is trained by Cynic philosophers, and he carries a lot of the ascetic lifestyle for a little while. Then Stoicism developed into a lot of different things. So they're very, very close, right? Literally, Stoics come from Cynics as far as the academic lineage. But the Cynics, man, the Cynics, they keep that edge. They keep that edge. And so this is kind of like this is one of the takeaway lessons, which is like what do we make of the various things that we do here, right? And I think that one of the lessons, and this is kind of like what inspired me to write this particular paper, in addition to the vomit of fortune quote, which is sometimes our features become our flaws, our vices become our virtues. The very character traits that define us and make us fantastic and powerful can also be the tragic flaw that undermines our lives. Okay? Aristotelians. I'm actually an Aristotelian. Aristotelians, they're like savvy, okay? They're people because they acknowledge that you need wealth, you need health, you need a non-crummy political situation. You actively have to work to reform all of that. The best good of practical life is justice, is having a good community, and because of that, you have to be very acute of that. You have to work in the system. You have to reform. Right? You have to be savvy. The downside of that is that you can become complicit in a lot of injustice, right? Complicit in a lot of injustice. An example here might be someone like Obama, right? Obama did a lot to advance certain progressive things in America, but he also signed a lot of orders for drone bombing, okay? So if you want to play in the system, you can do good stuff, but you're also going to be complicit in some really terrible stuff. Features become flaws, right? Stoics. Their feature is that they have a mental fortress, okay? They can insulate themselves from all of the vicissitudes, the bad stuff in life, right? They can kind of get over it. But the thing is if you're retreating into the fortress of your mind, you're not going to hear the calls of the people who are suffering, right? If you say that politics and circumstances and wealth don't matter to happiness, well, why are you motivated to do stuff? This is called the apraxia problem. There's a lot of potential answers to this, but I think that this feature, the strength of the Stoics, actually becomes a bug, right? It becomes a flaw. The Cynics, okay, so they avoid a lot of the problems of the other two because they stay outside of the system and they're constantly defiant and they're constantly arguing against things. What's the downside though? They're inept. They aren't forming political alliances. They aren't combating injustices maybe in the ways that we would like, right? Maybe sometimes you do have to grease palms. Maybe sometimes you do have to like work towards certain stuff. And so that's kind of like what I'm trying to get at. This is kind of a skeptical conclusion. I'm not saying that there's like a perfect solution here. I don't know the solution. I know that I'm an Aristotelian. I'm actually really sympathetic to the Stoics and the Cynics. Increasingly, I really like the Cynics and kind of like see the Stoics. Here's a provocative thing that I said in the Q&A, but I didn't say in the lecture. I'm kind of seeing Stoics as the sellouts more and more. Like the Stoics are dishonest Aristotelians. They like avail themselves of wealth and fortune and education and all of that, but they say that it's not important. I think that's really suspicious. I think it's really suspicious. Yeah, so maybe I'm more sympathetic to the Cynics and the Stoics, but like, look, I don't know the conclusion to reach from this. Life is just sometimes hard. So here's my final conclusion. Okay, my final conclusion is let's consider this story: Alexander going to Diogenes, Alexander offering anything, Diogenes saying, "Stand out of my light." Right? Consider the reactions. A lot of people were amused and walked away, didn't really think too much about cynicism. Just became a funny story that they forgot the next day. Alex, though, he said that thing that if he weren't Alex, he would want to be Diogenes. So you would suspect that, oh, maybe he changed his life. Maybe something happened, right? Made him wiser. No, right? No. And so not as famous as the Alexander story where this confrontation happens in a garden, are a couple of accounts. And I'm going to use contemporary American currency instead of the Greek stuff. But basically, one day, supposedly, Diogenes saw Alexander and he was like, "Hey, Alex, can you give me a couple bucks?" And Alexander replied, that's not a fitting gift for an emperor to bestow. I got more money than that, right? And so Diogenes was like, okay, fine, give me a couple $100, right? And Alexander said, that's not a gift that a cynic should be asking for. So Alexander baited him into an interaction where Diogenes asked for something that he shouldn't and kind of undermined his cynicism. Alexander was toying with him, right? He knew what he was doing. And then the second story is Alexander once sent a bowl of bones to Diogenes of Sinope, right? Diogenes supposedly said, this is a fitting gift for a dog, because cynics are called dogs, right? But it is not a fitting gift of a great to bestow. Alexander the Great, oh, the Great is sending bones? I've perturbed you so much that you're sending bones, right? So they had kind of an antagonistic relationship, right? So the final question, this is the conclusion, which is a question that we have to ask ourselves. And the question is moral purity worth the asceticism, discipline, and ridicule? That's the Cynic route. They maintain that moral purity, that distance from a lot of the complicities of society. But they live like ascetic lives against pleasure. They live intensely disciplined lives, and they get ridiculed by a lot of people, right? Or if I don't like that Cynic route, can I live with trying to improve the system like Aristotle, which means occasional cakes? We get some pleasures, right? We're not ascetic, but it also means complicity and injustice. So we give up that moral purity. I don't have an answer to this. I don't have an answer, but it's a question that I think is posed in this dialogue between the ancient schools, and I think it's one that we should pay attention to. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed that. The original presentation was 20 minutes. I've gone for almost an hour because I, talked about all of the discipline, gave you lots of asides and stuff like that. Thank you so much for your attention. Hope you enjoyed that.